On June 22, 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. Over 3 million German soldiers, backed by Axis allies, stormed across a front stretching nearly 2,000 miles. Hitler believed the Soviet Union would collapse in just a few months. He promised his generals and his people that the conquest of the East would be swift, decisive, and absolute. But instead of victory, Germany found itself trapped in a brutal war of attrition. By the end, millions were dead, and Hitler's dream of conquering the East had crumbled. So, why did this massive invasion fail? The answer lies in arrogance, strategy, logistics, ideology, and the sheer determination of the Soviet Union. First, let's look at Hitler's assumptions. He believed the Soviet Union was a fragile state, held together only by fear and Stalin's dictatorship. He thought its army was poorly trained, its people demoralized, and its economy primitive. In his mind, one sharp blow would send the whole structure crashing down. But this view ignored reality. The Soviet Union was not weak. It was vast, resource-rich, and capable of mobilizing millions. It spanned 11 time zones, had immense reserves of manpower, and possessed an industrial base that could be relocated beyond the reach of German bombers. Hitler's ideology blinded him. He saw Slavic peoples as racially inferior, incapable of organizing or resisting effectively. This arrogance was not only immoral, it was strategically disastrous. It meant Germany underestimated its opponent from the very beginning. Now consider the scale of the invasion. The German army advanced in 3 massive thrusts. Army Group North drove toward Leningrad. Army Group Center struck straight for Moscow. And Army Group South pushed into Ukraine, aiming to seize its farmland and resources. At first, the Germans seemed unstoppable. Blitzkrieg tactics ripped through Soviet defenses. Entire Soviet armies were encircled in enormous battles. At Minsk, Smolensk, and later Kiev, hundreds of thousands of prisoners were taken. By the end of summer, the Red Army had suffered staggering losses. To many observers, it looked as if Hitler had been right. The Soviet Union appeared to be on the verge of collapse. But appearances can be deceiving. The first cracks appeared in logistics. Germany's past victories had come in quick campaigns across Western Europe. Those were fought over smaller distances, with modern infrastructure. The Soviet Union was another matter entirely. The distances were immense, and roads were little more than dirt tracks. Railways used a wider gauge than Germany's, meaning every line had to be torn up and rebuilt before German trains could run. Every mile the Germans advanced stretched their supply lines thinner. Trucks broke down. Horses, which still carried much of the German army's supplies, died in huge numbers. Fuel shortages became chronic. Ammunition and spare parts couldn't reach the front fast enough. Soviet scorched earth tactics made things worse. As they retreated, they destroyed crops, burned villages, and dismantled factories. German soldiers were often forced to live off the land, but the land had been stripped bare. The farther the Wehrmacht advanced, the weaker it became. Despite horrific losses, the Soviet Union did not collapse. In one of the greatest logistical feats of the war, Stalin ordered hundreds of factories to be dismantled and moved east, beyond the Ural Mountains. There, far from the front, they were rebuilt and soon began producing weapons at incredible speed. By 1942, Soviet industry was outproducing Germany in tanks, planes, and artillery. The Red Army also transformed. The purges of the 1930s had gutted its leadership, but necessity forced rapid change. New commanders rose quickly, tactics evolved, and new weapons entered the fight. Chief among them was the T-34 tank, fast, durable, and deadly. German soldiers came to fear it, and perhaps most importantly, the Soviet people endured. Civilians dug trenches, built defenses, and supported the war effort despite terrible hardship. Cities became symbols of resistance. Hitler had imagined a weak enemy, but he had awakened a nation willing to fight to the last. Hitler himself became one of Germany's biggest obstacles. The original plan focused on Moscow, the heart of Soviet communications. Many German generals believed its capture would cripple the Soviet war effort, but Hitler constantly interfered. In August 1941, he diverted forces south to seize Ukraine. The Germans did win a huge victory at Kiev, capturing over 600,000 prisoners. But the cost was time. The advance on Moscow was delayed until autumn. By then, the Wehrmacht was exhausted, its supply lines overstretched, and the Soviets had reinforced their defenses. By trying to capture everything, Moscow, Leningrad, Ukraine, Hitler ended up capturing nothing. His lack of focus turned a daring plan into a slow bleed of men and resources, and then nature itself joined the battle. In autumn, the infamous Rasputitsa, or mud season, arrived. Heavy rains turned roads into rivers of muck, tanks bogged down, trucks sank, men slogged through endless mud. The German advance slowed to a crawl. Then winter struck. Temperatures plunged below -30 degrees Celsius. German soldiers had marched into Russia in summer uniforms. They lacked winter coats, gloves, and proper boots. Vehicles froze, oil thickened, guns jammed, frostbite claimed thousands. The German High Command had assumed the campaign would be over in weeks. They had not prepared for a Russian winter. The Soviets, however, were far better prepared. They had winter uniforms. They knew how to fight in the cold. For them, winter was home. By December, the Germans were at the gates of Moscow. Some advance units could see the city in the distance. Hitler boasted that victory was within reach. But the Soviets struck back. Reinforcements arrived from Siberia. Battle-hardened troops redeployed after Stalin learned Japan would not attack from the east. These fresh divisions, trained for winter, launched a massive counter-offensive. On December 5th, the Red Army attacked. The Germans, exhausted and frozen, were driven back. For the first time in the war, Hitler's army had been decisively stopped. The myth of the invincible blitzkrieg was shattered. But failure was not just about weather or distance, it was also about ideology. Hitler's invasion was not a conventional war, it was a war of annihilation. Civilians were starved or executed, entire towns were burned. Millions of Soviet prisoners of war were left to die. These policies did not weaken Soviet resistance, they strengthened it. Instead of turning populations against Stalin, German brutality convinced them they had no choice but to fight. Ukrainians, Belarusians and Balts, who might have welcomed liberation from Stalin, instead saw the Nazis as a greater evil. By turning the war into one of extermination, Hitler ensured the Soviets would fight with unmatched determination. By early 1942, the Soviet Union was battered but unbroken. Germany had failed to win the quick war it needed. Now Hitler faced a long struggle he could not afford. The Soviet Union had manpower reserves Germany could not match. Its relocated industries were producing weapons in staggering numbers, and Germany's enemies were multiplying. Britain still fought on, and after Pearl Harbor, the United States entered the war. Barbarossa, meant to deliver victory in months, had instead trapped Germany in a war of attrition against an opponent with greater resources, more territory, and more allies. So, why did Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union fail? Because it was built on arrogance and fantasy, because Hitler underestimated Soviet strength and overestimated his own, because the distances were too vast, the supply lines too fragile, and the weather too merciless, because Hitler's interference and ideological madness turned opportunity into disaster. Operation Barbarossa wasn't just a failed invasion, it was the turning point of World War II. From that moment on, Germany's fate was sealed. The war Hitler had unleashed to secure an empire ended up destroying his own. He had promised his people swift victory in the East. Instead, he delivered the beginning of the end. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell to not miss future history content.